This week on The Futurists, Melanie Hilton.
Well, AI is going to take over our jobs. It's just about repurposing to something higher value because at the end of the day, who wants to be the person that's repetitive, manual labor, 8 hours a day, very taxing on the human body? And there are so many ways that we can bring AI to bear that will give us the ability to leverage the brain more and hopefully the body less.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tersick, and this week my co-host Brett King is in transit once again to some distant part of the world. And actually, it's kind of appropriate that he's traveling around the world because today we're going to talk about traveling around the world. Our guest is an expert in the subject of the global supply chain, and she's someone I've wanted to have on the show for a very long time. I've known Melanie for many, many years. So, folks, I want to give a big warm welcome to Melanie Hilton. Hi, Melanie.
Hi, Rob. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. Where are you coming to us from today?
I am based outside Denver, Colorado, and super happy to be home today, which is also rare for me, but thankful nonetheless.
That's true. You're a traveling woman, and you are working at GS1 US. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your role at GS1, and then tell us what GS1 is?
Yes, at GS1 US, I lead our teams that focus on engaging with industry. Our key industries are apparel and general merchandise, food service, retail grocery, and healthcare. And I also lead our product team, our member support team, our innovation team, and our education and training team. But what a lot of people don't know is that GS1 US is sort of the quiet power behind the supply chain. We over 50 years ago developed a set of standards around product identification and messaging to help digitize supply chains all over the world. And we're most famously known, probably in the US, for the UPC barcode and with self-checkout. Lots of people now, oh yeah, that thing I do every week at the grocery store. GS1 barcodes are scanned over 10 billion times a day all over the world.
No.
So we've come a long way, but a lot of people don't realize that that unique number is something that somebody actually has to manage and make sure that they stay unique worldwide. And we built a whole system of standards off of that. And really, the goal is always about solving supply chain business problems.
So, for the folks who are listening, what Melanie's talking about is an organization called GS1. It's a global organization in the sense that it has an office or a branch or a part in every country that is part of the supply chain. More than 100 countries. The biggest country, of course, is the United States. That has to do with our big consumer economy and how globalized our economy is. And what Melanie just mentioned is the famous UPC barcode, that barcode that's on the back of every package that you buy in the grocery store. That was the origin of GS1 a long, long time ago. Grocery store retailers who competed with each other in the 1970s demanded a standard so that they didn't have to put labels on packages. They wanted a way to scan something that was printed on the package. And that was the origin of the barcode. It was competing companies deciding to cooperate in order to achieve a standard that made everyone's life easier. But that's also the beginning of big data. Can you tell us a little bit about the supply chain, the origin of supply chain with the barcode? Because I think a lot of people don't know this history, and I find it so fascinating. I am a supply chain geek, so I find that kind of stuff interesting.
Yes. Well, to your point, Robert, there was a lot of hand keying of prices at retail, and it was error prone. In addition, you had really no idea what you sold. You, at the end of the day, could go look at the register and determine you sold a lot of things for 49 cents or 99 cents. But that notion of at least being able to determine how many bags of potato chips went today, how many 4-packs of toilet paper, the barcode revolutionized the idea of price lookup and inventory management, certainly at the closest point to the consumer. And then you have to build it up from there because the reality is you have to know what inventory you have and where it's at. If you're trying to get better visibility in the store, you can then got to start going backward through all the places that product is coming from. And in many cases, you also now want to know where it's been. And so I think the origin of digitizing the supply chain came from the very simple task of making cashiers more efficient so that you didn't have long lines at the grocery store. And there's a fun commercial, I think it's called Barcode Betty, for anyone who wants to go watch. But from our perspective, it was I don't even know that at the time. I remember one of the grocery executives who was part of that original group said they didn't think there would be a need for more than 100,000 codes in the entire future of the world. So to your point around like analyzing the future, they had no idea that today we have issued billions and billions of capacity and unique identifiers for everything from what does cross that register for the consumer to the cases, pallets, containers, things that go on a ship, things that fly through the air, things that travel on rail or via trucks all over the world, the point that product is born until the point it crosses the register threshold. And now, in many cases, post consumption and material recycling. All of that requires unique identities and then the data associated with it. So, to your point of big data, I think it started out as very small data. This number, ring it up at $1.99. Now it's just exploded to every attribute about the product and then all of the use cases a business or a consumer can take advantage of with that data.
I remember really clearly when I was a kid, when I was a very young man, or boy, I should say, my mother would send me to the grocery store to pick up some things because back in the day, that's how it was done. If you had boys around the house, you sent them off to do errands. And I would go to the grocery store, and I always thought it was so strange to see these lines of people, mostly women, shopping and getting groceries for their families. And the lines would be 17 or 18 people long. Like, I don't think anyone who shops today has any idea how long grocery store lines were in the 1960s and early 70s. And that was because a cashier had person at a cash register actually had to manually key in every single item, and of course, they made mistakes. And sometimes the people who were shopping would read their receipt very carefully and they'd say, "Oh, you got this wrong." And they'd have to do the whole thing over again. So the lines were super long. This was becoming a gigantic problem as early as the 1960s. And prior to the 60s, we didn't have supermarkets, right? And this is before my time, but there were, just local grocers where, kind of more the way we think of a farmer's market. That was how shopping was handled. And the other thing that was true back then is most of the stuff that we purchased was local in the sense that it was made either locally or in the state. I remember interstate commerce was such a big deal when I was a kid that they used to have TV commercials about it. I grew up in Ohio, and there would be TV commercials about orange juice, and it was like fresh orange juice from Florida. And they show the picture of the guys in the truck, and it was like one man sleeps while the other man drives, and it would show you that like the orange juice was delivered in a couple of days. So I guess the point there is that interstate commerce was so novel in the 1960s and early 70s that it was interesting enough to make a TV commercial about. Like that was like a unique attribute. Fast forward to today, where you go to a grocery store. If you go to like let's say a super center, like a Walmart super center, there'll be 150,000 items in that store, individual items. And they're all coming from international deliveries. I don't think people realize how internationalized everything that we buy is, whether it's our clothing, like you said, the apparel is a huge item that's shipped, but also our food comes from all over the world. It's why we have
Yeah.
fresh vegetables and fruit year round now. People take it for granted, but that certainly wasn't the case 50 years ago. And it's also true with our pharmaceuticals, and it's true with all of our automobiles and most of the electronics and so forth. So just about everything that you might buy, whether it's in a Best Buy or a Walmart or a big grocery store, comes from someplace else. Now, that change is all due to two innovations, just two innovations. This is about the power of a single innovation or two innovations together. The first one was the introduction of containerized shipping, which begins in the late 60s. There were some experiments with it in World War II and then in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, but they didn't standardize on a common size, the 20-foot equivalent container unit, until the late 60s. And when they did, it started a riot at the port because prior to that, the way ships were unloaded was with stevedores. Like a bunch of burly guys would climb down inside of a ship and haul the stuff out. And no surprise, stuff got broken or dropped or wet, or sometimes if it was whiskey, bottles would just magically disappear. And so manufacturers started to agitate for standardized containers, including, by the way, the Scottish distillers. They were a huge proponent of that. So you had standardized shipping coming in the late 60s. And then the UPC barcode, I think, was introduced in 1974. Is that right?
Correct. The first scan. Yeah.
And the reason they use that particular thing, those barcode, those stripes, which is basically just a picture of a number. It's just a machine readable picture of a number. The reason they use that is because with the available technology that they had for scanning, that was what was most legible and easiest to print. So there's no real magic behind the barcode. Of course, today barcodes have evolved in a million ways. But those two innovations revolutionized the way we buy things. And in the process, they also introduced big data. Because the data that was scanned at the store, that was really there to just make it easy to scan products at the point of sale. That data was also relayed to manufacturers and eventually became the data that tells a manufacturer who might be based in Asia what's selling in Indianapolis or what's selling in Topeka. And that's incredibly important information because they can adjust what they're making. If there's a great demand, they can start to gear up or they can dial it back if there's no demand. So the barcode standard and the other standards that are managed by GS1, they're kind of like the glue that holds together the global supply chain. Tell us a little bit about the standards that you manage and how is that process managed? Like, how do you arrive at a global standard for a million companies?
Well, collaboration, you highlighted it a little bit earlier in what you were saying that if people weren't willing to cross competitive lines to say, this isn't about me beating you, on customer value, it's about us creating a level playing field so that all of industry can benefit, we would have never had even the basic barcode. And that repeated approach to collaboration is really why GS1 exists. And GS1 US, we say things like we're neutral, we're not for profit. People are like, yeah, snooze fest. But that ability to come together, comply with antitrust guidelines, which none of us want to go to jail. I always say that the standards are about three things: making money, saving money, or avoiding a prison jumpsuit. Right. But people want to avoid risk. And so they're very conscious about where do we collaborate, where do we compete. So we sit in that unique space that says, you want to go solve problems for your company. We want to solve problems for all of industry. So bring us your unique business opportunity. Let us spend some time convening a group of willing people to talk about it. So without collaboration, standards don't exist. And I think, Robert, you've probably pointed this out in past conversations you and I've had about anything from USB ports to plugs and walls, right? Without standards, none of those things exist. And I think sometimes
Yeah.
people take things for granted because it's just, we've made it so easy for them. But there was a lot of heavy lifting that happened. And usually by, say, 20 to 50 leading companies in an industry agreeing to band together and set aside their competitive differences to further advancements in the supply chain. And I think that's what gets to the heart of how do you position yourself for the future? You got to find ways to do more with less and do it profitably and satisfy your customer, because at the end of the day, if they're not buying your product, you won't be in business long.
It's a really good point about cooperation. Just to use a different example, but it's a good one. I think it illustrates the point. Um, the cables that we use to charge our electronic gizmos. Now that everybody carries electric gizmos with them, whether it's a cell phone or some other kind of thing, a tablet. For many years you had to carry a dedicated charger that was specifically for that device. If you think back to like the 1990s,
Mm-hmm.
when I worked for Sony, I remember very famously at a conference, Martha Stewart showed up when Howard Stringer, the CEO of Sony, was on stage, and he was giving a talk. And at the end of the talk, he asked for questions, and Martha Stewart stood up, and so of course they called on her, and she said, "Howard, I brought all the connections, all the chargers for my Sony devices," and she had more than a dozen, and none of them were compatible. They were all different. And Howard laughed. He's a very gracious guy, and he said, Actually, our components, that our accessories division is very, very profitable this year." So it was like kind of a funny moment, but it pointed out that if companies don't standardize, it creates hardship for the user. It actually creates a problem for your customer. And companies that are in the habit of putting a barrier in front of their customer, well, they tend not to be very successful. Sony is an excellent example of that, by the way. And so the point we're making here is that companies compete fiercely, and that competition is what drives innovation. Companies are always trying to find a way to do it a little better, a little cheaper, a little faster, and so they're competing constantly. But eventually they get to a point where it's like, gosh, everybody who buys any device has to have a way to plug it into a wall and charge it up. Do we really need to compete on chargers? Is that really where we want to focus our competition? And sometimes industry will agree that they want to standardize. They'll say, well, actually, it makes life easier for consumers if they can just have one thing like like a standardized plug, USB-C, for instance. We've seen to finally, after
Yep.
10 years of thrashing, figured out the one USB kind of connector. But man, is that a long process? It takes forever to do it. I've done it in telecom, and often you'll find that companies are coming into those meetings with an agenda. They're driving a very aggressive agenda that favors them and their suppliers and their ecosystem. They don't want to compromise, and so it can take many years to arrive at a standard, which is why we have to kind of carry around like 10 different versions of a USB cable until industry finally gets it together to standardize. So your organization manages like 100 different data standards. And did they all arise through that process of kind of like horse trading and deal making and arm wrestling and so forth between corporations? Is that basically, are you guys the umpires? Is that what GS1 does?
Yes, we call it consensus. So maybe maybe a euphemistic term, and also we would say, through through agreement that is based on a common set of benefits. And so yeah, that's honestly what the mind bend is for a GS1 employee, is figuring out, how do I create a common set of benefits? Oftentimes you can find a common set of benefits between a role. So if you think of retailers, they're serving the consumer. It can be very easy to say, hey, this is the benefit for the retailer. But if I'm the brand and I'm the one manufacturing the product and I'm the one putting it in the package and I'm the one who's going to put the barcode on it, or the two-dimensional barcode, to get the consumer engagement, what's the unlock for me? And so constantly assessing the persona and who's going to derive what benefit, and then how do you marry those benefits across an industry? That's one of the things, to your point of like bringing, your agenda and your team. We always tell our members, you get to take your enterprise hat off and put your industry hat on. And we have just been very fortunate over these 50 years to have had a group of Fortune 100, Fortune 2000, all those companies willing to sit at the table and contribute in that way. I think USB-C is probably no different, right? But you've also seen standards efforts fall apart because people can't arrive at that common ground. But yes, herding
Mhm.
cats, getting everybody to the table, and consensus, the baseline agreement for how we can move standards forward.
And so effectively what companies are agreeing to do when they agree to a standard is they're basically saying, okay, we're going to freeze competition on this in this area. We're going to freeze it, which means we're going to freeze all the competition and all the innovation because we're going to agree to just do it this one way. And we're going to focus on competition someplace else. When I was in telecom, what they said is like, what you see happening in telecom is that we have ruthless battles for infrastructure. But then when finally the industry agrees to a standard, then the competition just goes up a level. And then they have another ruthless battle there. And they agree to another standard. And then the competition goes up to the next level and so forth. So for consumers, I'm making it sound like it's a battle. And in some cases it is. But for consumers, what this means is you get better stuff cheaper, faster. And that has been our experience as consumers for the last 50 years. The other aspect of that is the international economy has been stitched together much more tightly over the past 50 years. When the barcode was first introduced, it was rather expensive to upgrade a grocery store. You had to buy computers. That was expensive in the 1970s. It's still expensive today for a company to upgrade to computers. The benefits basically meant that they didn't have to do inventory and they didn't have to have some kid running around with a labeler relabeling the prices when the prices went up. In the 70s we had inflation, so prices were going up all the time and they were constantly relabeling. The barcode saved that problem. But one of the unexpected benefits was big data, and as I mentioned earlier, that big data could be used by manufacturers all over the world. And so retailers discovered they had a new asset. They discovered that they had a data asset that could be sold to manufacturers, that it was valuable to manufacturers to have data about what was selling and when was selling and what volumes were selling and where they were selling and so forth. And that information wasn't just valuable to domestic manufacturers, it was also valuable to international manufacturers. And that's where the container ship fits in the picture, because the container ship made it possible for us to ship goods all over the world. Again, this is something that we take for granted today. We don't even think about it until there's like a pandemic like COVID-19 that upsets the supply chain and stops all those ships from unloading. Yeah, I live here in Los Angeles. There were some 65 ships off the coast at any given time waiting to unload because COVID had knocked out the big port in Long Beach, and so there was this huge backlog, and as a result, people couldn't get toilet paper and other things in the grocery stores. Like the supply chain is run in such a tight way that if there's any disruption, you see the results next week in the store, and then it takes quite a while to resupply. But that is a transformation that I think people are unaware of because they don't see it. What it means is that there are manufacturers all over the world who are paying close attention to what is selling in Indianapolis or Illinois or in Milwaukee. They want that information because it helps them understand how to optimize their business. And of course, they do the same for cities all over the world. So today, there are some 1,300 container ports. And at any given moment, there are 5,000 container ships or more on the sea. And each of those 5,000 ships has some 20,000 containers on it. Sometimes there's up to 25,000. They're enormous ships. So there's this massive volume of goods being transported all over the world that most of us are completely blissfully unaware of. We just notice it when we go to the grocery store and they don't have, they've run out of some cereal that we want to buy. Then we kind of grumble about it. But we don't really pay attention to it. The supply chain is this gigantic thing that touches everybody on the planet, and yet we're completely unaware of it. What's your own personal experience in Denver of the supply chain? Where do you encounter the benefits of the GS1 data standards?
Well, I am very typically focused. To your point of geek, when I go shopping, people do not like to shop with me because I'm analyzing things like expiration dates on products in the frozen aisle, and these things, to the point of the barcode and how it really revolutionized the checkout experience and also benefited the inventory experience. Now things have gotten so much more complex with the notion of stock rotation, product recalls, expiration. And so I'll go into a store and I remember looking at frozen pizzas in an aisle and being like, wow, these frozen pizzas are past their expiration date. The problem is that little code that says expiration date is printed, like stamped into the bottom of the pizza box. Somebody's got to go read it. I was fortunate to have my glasses on to see it. And I think that's really where I start to see the pain. I would also say pain in when you are experiencing a recalled product where you try to buy something, you get told at the register you can't buy it because it's been flagged for a product recall. But in fact, most retailers know very little about the specifics of a recalled product. We've all experienced leafy greens have been a challenge, multiple Thanksgivings in the US where we have not had salad because of a leafy green recall. But even on hard goods, like say
Mm-hmm.
a baby stroller, the manufacturer can be quite specific in saying it's this batch of strollers, these lot codes that were produced on these dates. The retailer systems do not have the ability to store that information. And so you can really deplete customer satisfaction by saying, I can't sell you that stroller. And someone like me, who knows better, I'm like, yes, but I'm on their website. I can show you what the recall was affecting, and it wasn't this stroller. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, ma'am, I can't sell you that stroller. My register won't let me sell it. That is to me some of the pain today that we've evolved. So to your point now, even more so need the data, even more so probably need to move beyond that one-dimensional bars and stripes carrier, bars and
Mhm.
spaces carrier to get to a more data-rich experience where the consumer and the brand or the retailer can elevate the commerce experience because they now have the power of the cloud behind them, the power of the edge device, so many ways now to unlock the data. So I think to your point of big data, so much of it now is the data is available, but we haven't found a way to bridge making that data, tying that data to the user experience as it happens. So we're still always a chance to evolve, but I think those are where some of the poignant pains for supply chain are now that we've moved past the shortages of the pandemic.
Okay, cool. We're going to go to a break now, and we'll be back in just a minute. When we come back, Melanie, I want to dig deeper into this topic because I think it's super interesting. This idea that every product on the shelf is surrounded by an invisible cloud of data, although that data isn't always really well associated with that particular item. Okay, folks, you are listening to The Futurists, and my guest today is Melanie Hilton. We'll be back in just a minute after this announcement.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hi, welcome back to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tersick, and this week my co-host Brett is in flight, traveling to yet another far-flung region on the planet Earth, as he seems to always be doing. My guest is Melanie Hilton from the organization GS1 US. And GS1 is a global standards body that manages data standards for the supply chain. And as I said in the beginning, these standards are kind of like the glue that holds together the global supply chain. There is no central controlling authority. There's no government that mandates how the supply chain operates. There are some rules and regulations, of course, but companies participate voluntarily in the supply chain. It's just a free market at work. But how do those companies coordinate? How do they handle the transfer of goods? How do they even know what goods they're handling and receiving? Well, you need data for that. You need to have a way to understand what's in the box, where it came from, and so forth. And that is where GS1 fits in. GS1 identity standards are what make it possible for companies on different parts of the planet, in different places on the planet, to collaborate, share, and transact. So, Melanie, one of the things we were talking about before the break is that there's a lot of data about items. Every product on the shelf is surrounded by a cloud of information. It's an invisible cloud. We can't see it with our eyes, but it's there, right? Whether that's marketing material or how-to or instruction manuals, the design material, all the marketing and video that's associated with that particular product. And many other things, like you mentioned earlier, recall notices or product upgrades or software upgrades, and so on. I mean, there is like a gigantic volume of data on every product, even the simplest product you can imagine. Now, we can't see that. And so when humans can't see stuff, we tend to ignore it. We tend not to think about it. But it is there. And sometimes that data is not appended to the product, like it gets lost in transit, if you will. And that can create all kinds of problems. And this is one of the things that GS1 exists to solve. Like that is your kind of raison d'etre, is to help companies figure out how to glue that data back together. The way it was described to me by one of your colleagues is that a product is typically designed by a marketing company. Like imagine, Apple Computer in Cupertino. They design these beautiful, elegant computers, which comprise thousands of different components inside of them. And then all those components are manufactured by companies all over the world. And they're assembled by typically a company in China or sometimes elsewhere in the world. And then they're put on a container ship and they're delivered to an Apple store near you or an e-commerce company not near you. And along the way, somewhere in that process, all that data that's generated, all that great marketing and all that great design data that Apple generates, that gets disconnected because you end up with just this part, just this one item in a box. And the only thing that we have to track that with is the UPC barcode on the package. That's the thing that is scanned at every point in the way along as it's delivered through the supply chain to the retailer or the e-commerce company. And then at that point, we're desperately trying to reassociate that product with all that other data, all that marketing information and the how-to and the instruction manuals and the recall guides and so forth, the warranty. All that information is out there in the cloud somewhere, and we have a desperate struggle to reattach it to that product. Can you talk to me a little bit about the cloud half and some of the challenges that you've encountered and some of the solutions that you've come up with for reassociating data with products?
Yes, this is an interesting conundrum indeed, and especially with the notion of shifting things to the edge, because latency is still a problem in a lot of supply chain environments where I just don't have connectivity to the web. And sometimes that's policy, it's limited by policy, sometimes it's limited by device. But increasingly, as you start to see more internet capability happen across and I like to think the supply chain is three parts, right? There's the product moving through the supply chain. There's all the information, to your point. Sometimes it's with the product, sometimes in the cloud. And then there's the financial supply chain, because people want to get paid, because it's all about making money. And so when we think about the cloud half of the product, the unique identifier that GS1 administers, the global trade item number, whether it's embedded in a one-dimensional barcode, a QR code, or RFID, what's so phenomenal about that is it is globally unique. It is the connector to all of that cloud data. Now, how much of that data you need to put on the product, because I don't have access to the internet in a certain context, interesting thing that companies have to evaluate. But at any point in time, if I haven't lost the fidelity in creating that product birth and life cycle record, somebody's going to be able to take advantage of that data. And this can also be governed by permissions, by cryptography, you bring all the technology to bear, which is what fascinates me and kind of keeps me going on this journey. But I think you've got to figure out, this is why we've been looking at moving to two-dimensional barcodes on products, QR codes. People know them. They know them from COVID, when they used to scan menus in restaurants instead of being given a paper menu to look at. But a QR code on a product is a gateway into that product's cloud half. So how I scan this and a whole bunch of cool things happen. What ingredients are in this? Where was it sourced? Where did the oranges for this orange juice come from? What are the allergens I need to be considered? Is there a promotion? Can I have a coupon for this product? So many things are happening as the consumer engages, as a store associate engages, and as supply chain operators push product through. And I think fidelity is really the key for us, is never losing sight of the unique identifier embedded in the product or the carton, and then tying that to the cloud half. And then it's just a matter of connecting the cloud, because sometimes that cloud gets disconnected, but we still have the data. And once we can marry those two together, we have so many rich experiences we can have and better business decisions we can make.
Mm-hmm. I think people don't realize how hard the barcode actually works. The barcode does a bunch of jobs. When we typically think of it as a way to represent price when you're scanning a product at the checkout. That's how most people encounter it. Like you said earlier, it's scanned 10 billion times a day at point of sale. So that's most people's experience of the barcode. But if you work in a warehouse and you're scanning barcodes, you're getting one set of information, and that might be about where the product came from and where it's going and how long it's been in transit. If you work in retail, you might get information when you scan the barcode about what shelf it should go on and how it should be displayed, or any kind of promotion, or if it should be taken off the shelf because there's a recall. So different people have different views of that data. Same barcode, but it's doing a bunch of different jobs along the way as a product makes its way through that global supply journey. And one of the projects you and I talked about and worked on a couple of years ago is a thing called Magic Link. Can you tell us about the mission there with Magic Link? Because I think it is kind of magic, the Digital Link initiative.
Yes. GS1 Digital Link was about embedding a URL directly into the product's barcode. So the barcode is just a way to read a piece of data, right? Today it's reading that little unique identifier, to your point around the price lookup. But taking that to a two-dimensional world where you have more of a QR style code, you can put a URL which just points you to somewhere on the internet. So you immediately connect. We used to talk, I remember when you and I first started talking about this, we talked about connecting dumb products to the internet, because it's just a can of beans. It's just a pack of toilet paper. But connecting it to the internet in a way that lets the consumer truly engage with the product, but also actually has so much power in the supply chain for store associates. And when you and I consider the future of supply chain, that one of the biggest things is efficiency, because labor is a challenge and throughput is a challenge. And we have to, as I had said earlier, we have to do more with less. So the more that the barcode, whether it's the data in it, like a digital link, which is a URL experience that can be directed in many different ways, or it's then tying that magic digital link to the cloud half of the product, very important in terms of getting me full access that I need, regardless of the use case that is applicable to me.
Now, the ability to connect data to physical stuff, like we were just saying, the Internet of dumb things. These products aren't necessarily smart in the sense that they don't have a processor or power or internet connectivity themselves, but they can still be scanned by smart devices. That's a giant unlock because it allows us to introduce a lot of other technology particularly in retail, but also at every point in the supply chain. So tell me about the use of novel technologies in the supply chain, things like artificial intelligence and robotics, because that's actually a big trend that, again, I think people are not aware of. Can you talk a little bit about AI at retail?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked because this is where I think it gets really exciting. AI, in my opinion, is one of those technologies that is no longer. It's not like blockchain. The hype cycle's real. So, and not that I just a disclaimer. I still believe blockchain has power, but the hype cycle is real on this. And so, to me, with the opportunity that we have with AI is about connecting all the data together and the economy of scale that particularly generative AI, bringing all these disparate data sources together and sort of creating intelligent prediction or intelligent analysis, that is got to be so appealing to somebody who's being pressured. Supply chains are a cost center. They're not considered the revenue center of any business. And as a cost center, you're
Mhm.
constantly being pressured to be more efficient. And so AI is like, oh, wow, machines doing work that I can't even hire enough humans to do at a capacity that I can't even begin to fathom, that allows me to give my humans the ability to do higher value tasks. And we talked about this early on before really Gen AI became commonplace as robotic process automation, right? How do we train software to do repetitive tasks? But this idea of being able to truly manage by exception at any point in the supply chain. So we would say manage by exception means the container's late. What do I do about it? This supplier has gone offline. Where do I source a component from differently? Now, what we're saying is all the way down to the store level. Should I place charcoal close to hot dogs in June so that I can sell more of both? Those kind of things where you're artificial intelligence systems and your data science teams, whether they're insourced or outsourced, can start to connect all the dots for you and just allow you to make that one decision that's going to be the difference between more profit, more revenue, and not. Like that is what gets me really jazzed about AI for supply chain is that AI will find patterns we can't even begin to comprehend as humans. That will be such an aha. So the light bulb comes on, benefit happens, and then people, I think also get a little bit over their fear because AI still in supply chain is all about job replacement. And I think you and I talked about this recently with the port strike that happened,
Yeah.
right? Where, well, AI is going to take over our jobs. Stevedores, your point around stevedores, it's just about repurposing to something higher value. Because at the end of the day, who wants to be the person that's right, repetitive, manual labor, 8 hours a day, very taxing on the human body? And there are so many ways that we can bring AI to bear that will give us the ability to leverage the brain more and hopefully the body less. Matters to me, especially as I get older. But also the exception driven ability to make decisions, because I think that's what's so valuable for a business that's going to give them, going back to my three tenets: make money, save money, and avoid risk. The power, it's all in the power of the data, and AI is a huge unlock for that data. And I think we'll have to blend predictive AI and generative AI really to get maximum benefit from it.
So, for the folks who are listening, Melanie made reference to labor action that occurred in the beginning of October 2024 on the East Coast of the United States and also in the Gulf Coast, where the Longshoremen's Union threatened to strike, and the issue was automation in the ports. Now, we've been talking about artificial intelligence. From a computer science standpoint, there is a continuum from artificial intelligence, machine intelligence, to robotics. That's seen as a spectrum of capabilities, and they're similar in many respects. That's why they're considered often grouped together as one set of capabilities. And so, as we introduce artificial intelligence into the supply chain, the way that shows up at a port is a robotic container port. And this is amazing to me that during the pandemic, even as container ports were shutting down around the world, some container ports switched to full automation. A lot of people don't know about that, but of course, it began in China. As you may recall, during the pandemic in China, there was a total lockdown, so people couldn't go to work, but they still had to get goods out of the country to keep the economy going. And at that point, they started to robotize container ports. And if you're familiar with container ports, there are those gigantic cranes that run on railroad tracks that can pick up an entire container and put it onto a ship and place it quite accurately. You still need human beings. You can't fully automate it because humans have to come in and lock those containers together. That's not going to be something that's easily automated. But the actual moving around of those big containers, that is a job that is great for a robot to do because those big cranes are already running on rails. So they're not going to go running amok. Now, I mentioned earlier there are 1,300 container ports around the world of varying efficiency. And among the least efficient ports on the world, no surprise, are those in the United States. The very ports where they tried to introduce automation now, because Asian ports have become automated. In some cases, the West Coast ports in the U.S. have also become automated. But in the East Coast, they lag behind, and they are among the least efficient ports in the Americas. So no surprise, there was an effort underway to automate them, and that's where the strike came from. The workers said, no way, no robots. We want to keep our jobs. And they've had a battle. Now, the interesting outcome there, Melanie, is what the strikers wanted was higher wages, not just to keep automation up, but higher wages, and they got that. They got a raise. However, this is a real problem for the global economy, right? When you have labor getting pay increases that don't come from increased productivity, that is inflationary. Like that's literally the path to inflation is to crank up salaries without the accompanying productivity gain. In other words, we need the automation in the ports. We need the productivity increases in order to create the pool of profit that can pay for salary increases without inflation. That's an economic nuance that a lot of people don't understand, right? So we look at it and say, gosh, those poor workers are being replaced by machines. My heart goes out to them. I sympathize with them. Sure, they're right. But actually, that's not correct. To give people wages without productivity gains is actually going to impose. Eventually, you'll pay for that at the cash register as a consumer. You're going to pay for that in the form of higher prices. But automation isn't the only thing that's happening in the supply chain. The other thing that's happening is that there's this great unlock of consumer behavior and understanding, and that's where new products can be discovered, new opportunities for service, ways to improve and engage consumers. This is the part I find so fascinating because it's very creative. It's not just this ruthless process of squeezing out more efficiency. What are some of the most creative applications of technology that you've seen in your vantage point and as the head of the innovation team at GS1 US?
Well, I think for us, right, it's about democratizing data, crowdsourcing. The way that a consumer can connect with a product now as so different from the past gives such a window into potential behavior, actual behavior, linked data for brands and retailers. And I will tell you from kind of a mundane supply chain perspective, one of the brand's biggest challenges, and this goes back to the point you made around retailers realizing the value of this data and then charging the suppliers for the data. Well, the brand creates the product. There's some argument to be made that the person who created the product needs to know the mind of the consumer and the performance of the product so they can make better products for the future. Otherwise, it's this weird vacuum of self-talk. So it's very inside out. And the idea that now, powered by a mobile device, which so many consumers carry, and what they're doing in store, even connecting it to what they're doing online, because all your devices are listening to each other and talking to each other. Brands now are creating connections with consumers they didn't have before. I was talking with a big seafood manufacturer, and they said from the point we ship the cans of tuna out of our distribution center, we have no idea what happens. We don't know what happens at retail unless the consumer picks up the can and scans it. Well, now because of mobile connectivity, the ubiquity, the ability to scan the product, I can tell a consumer, hey, I'll give you a coupon if you just scan this. And that scan will tell me where they scanned it, what device they used to scan it. If they opt in to share some optional data with me, additional insight into the demographic of the consumer itself. And we've seen this. So we've seen this ironically with your lunchtime meal, canned meats. We've also seen it with diapers. Huge industry around changing babies and many, many diapers for any new parent knows they go through. And the ability for the diaper brand to be able to offer a coupon to the consumer directly rather than rely on that broker that typically the retailer serves, and a lot of times data getting lost. This is the avoiding single points of failure, I think, is one of the most novel things that our innovation team is looking at. But I would say then second, and I know you didn't ask me for 2 points, but I would be remiss if I didn't say this, is about connecting all the way back to the source of supply, to the producer, the grower, who grew the lettuce, who grew the coffee beans, who grew the tomatoes, and being able to connect producers and farmers to the end consumer. In some cases, that community really hungers for that connection, and in some they're like, yeah, look, I'm going to grow tomatoes whether you buy them or not. But I think the idea that knowing where something was sourced and then being able to trace it. In food service, this is big because you're not served a tomato at the register. You're served a salad, you're served a burrito, you're served a hamburger. Many ingredients go into the making of that experience, and everyone who contributes to that experience could get benefit from the intelligence of the data about the experience if we can pass it back upstream. So that's one of the things that my innovation team has really been looking at is better last mile, how to get stuff to consumers, better connecting first mile to last mile. Everybody in the chain wants to know something. Let's share the data with them. And I think the barrier of incentives and how do we make data sharing, how do we incentivize data sharing across partners is due for disruption. So maybe something that you and I will get to talk about in the future is how that's got to change, because a lot of our supply chain behaviors are still very legacy, even though technology has leapfrogged the way we do business quite incredibly.
That's one of the problems with running a standards body is that it's not a leading indicator, it's a lagging indicator because you have to wait for everybody in the supply chain to catch up and get on the same page. As you're speaking about the benefits of better data and visibility and transparency from the point of purchase, what crossed my mind is there's a second parallel thing happening, which is that our media landscape has changed a lot. So in the United States now, half the people who used to pay for cable television no longer do, right? They're getting their video fix some other way, probably from a streaming service. And that sounds like a great thing. Most people like streaming video and so forth. Most people like not watching commercials. But that poses an existential threat to any consumer brand because their fortunes depend on their ability to communicate with large audiences. This is why things like the Super Bowl or the World Series are so important for advertisers, because it's really the only way for them to reach a big audience fast. That's why TV commands so much advertising money, even though it's now in decline. So as the broadcasting channels become less relevant to a lot of homes, that means that the manufacturers have to figure out a way to reach consumers with their information, with their message, with the news about new products, new ways to use their products, and so forth. And that means that the package has to work harder. The package in the store has to somehow convey all that information. And once again, this is another place to use the data standards, because if you can convince people to scan a package, now the manufacturer can get first-party data from that consumer. They can actually get into a dialogue with that consumer if they want to, and they can start to tell them about novel products or new ways to use the existing products. Can you talk a little bit about the transformation of the consumer experience and consumer discovery and the way retail is changing? Because there's a lot of innovation going that I think people do not know about.
Definitely. I think it starts from connecting what's happening online to the physical world. So my journey is taking a different path, and I want to be able to get data, share data, manage data through that more complex path to purchase. I think that's one thing that we're seeing. The other thing too is the technology in retail. So to your point about the evolution of retail, like retail media networks in store are really taking off in terms of delivering media experiences to the consumer while they're shopping. And the product interaction, I think, is one, but also dynamic electronic shelf labels that can change pricing more effectively. I think the better we get with product precision and knowing we can offer discounts. Hey, these bananas are, probably only have one more day of life. Let's put these in $1 off. And anything that we can do to automate how that occurs is going to accelerate our ability to deliver it to a consumer, because anything that relies on labor is going to quickly run into a capacity challenge. And so those are some of the interesting things we start to see, is connecting all the technology in the store whether that's in the frozen environment, shelf-stable environment, whether you're going into produce, how the consumer is going to interact with their own device. What are the devices store associates can now use to make them more efficient? And then how are you bridging that conversation beyond the point of sale? And this to me is in packaging recycling, in actual product recycling, and being able to create, I think, a new economy is what I'm starting to, well, not starting, I believe this for a long time, is that reducing waste streams actually should result in new business models and new economies that are going to create a whole secondary supply chain around material and product recycling, which then helps us deliver on environmental impact and sustainability goals, as well as have a true circular economy where we're taking the value of assets much, much further down to zero than using landfill as our default behavior. So it's pretty amazing when you think about the power that the technology thread is going to have all the way through. And then now my role as a consumer isn't just about what happened at the point of sale. I'm really part of the supply chain. Maybe that's one of my big takeaways is, convince consumers that they're part of the supply chain, and then they can actually have an impact in small or large ways. For some of us who work in it every day, we're the circle of believers. We love to do this all the time. But for other people, simple decisions that they end up making actually have that legacy value that I think many businesses and even many people want to leave behind for future generations. So technology is going to power all of that, and our willingness to embrace it is going to make it happen faster.
That's great. Melanie, thank you very much for bringing it around to the circular economy that secondary supply chain of recycling products that are at the end of their life. That's a nice, hopeful vision for the future, and it's a great illustration of how this humble barcode can do so much for us. Well, Melanie, thank you very much for joining the Futurists. It's always a pleasure to see you. It's been great to have you on the show. I want to give a thanks to the folks at Provoke Media who make the show possible, and a big thanks to our audience, the listeners who engage and send us suggestions and ideas and questions and comments. We welcome all of that. We'll be bringing you another Futurist every week, and next week Brett will be back, and we'll continue with another guest who will tell us all about the future that they envision and are creating. And until then, we will see you in the future.
Well, that's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.